Dave Dove, Cortez, Colorado archaeologist, we're going to kind of co-present this. And so this paper, this is a manuscript in writing, by the way. If you've read the title, you probably have absolutely no idea what the presentation is about. It's still going to be the published title. Let me deconstruct it for a moment. Let me retitle it. This could be titled, Sourcing Prehistoric Materials to the Geographic Landscape. Does that make more sense? All right, so this paper, this is kind of middle ground. And I'm going to talk a little bit about methodologies and sourcing analysis and tell you where I kind of step into that equation. So my name is Stephen DiNaso. I'm a geologist, I'm a geospatial scientist. I do geochemistry, I do geostatistics. I have a background in mining geology, in my undergraduate years anyway. And so I'd like to think of myself as a self-proclaimed geoarchaeologist. I think I have a lot of those components anyway. So I got involved in this about 15 years ago. And I didn't want to necessarily go in and change the present methodology or methodologies that we use to source prehistoric artifacts, but I wanted to expound upon it. And I think what I have to say is going to be best explained, because originally this paper here, it was going to focus on this. Python, by the way, is a programming language. So I have a Python-enabled compound sourcing algorithm. It's a technical thing that if I had PowerPoint slides, I could probably convey the ideas to you. We tested this algorithm, we've tested this hypothesis, and I think it's going to be best exemplified, best explained, excuse me, by example. So here's what I set out to do. As a geologist, we wanted to start with the landscape. You see, in every prehistoric artifact, and everybody knows this, there's this latent signal, right? There's an inherent part of sherds, of plasters, and where does that geochemical signature come from? It comes from the landscape, right? It comes from the soils, it comes from the clays, it comes from all the laccolithic exposures that give us, for example, diorite and quartz monzonite tempers that you find in the pottery in southeastern Utah, for example. I wanted to trace the geochemical signature in the source materials in an attempt to source prehistoric pottery, and on a larger geographic scale, meaning a small geographic area, I wanted to test that hypothesis. And that's where Dave Dove comes in. Now, very briefly on sourcing analyses. Modern sourcing analyses in the past decade, maybe decade and a half, if we look at some of the statistical methodologies and some of the analytical instrumentation methodologies, we can probably push that back almost 3 decades. It's a twofold or two-step process. So on one side, we have the elemental analysis, right? We're looking for something unique in the prehistoric artifact, whether it's a plaster or a sherd. We're looking at something unique. We want to look at elemental abundances, relative elemental abundances, right? Something unique. The second part of that is we want to apply classical statistic methodologies so that we can interpret that data. So let me give you an example. Maybe you have, as we did, 100 Kiva plaster samples and soils that we're going to analyze. Maybe you have 500 sherds that you're going to analyze. Depending upon the instrumental analytical method that you use, you're going to have a very, very large set of data. And it's not humanly possible to understand that data without beating it up a little bit with some multivariate statistics, right? For those of you who are familiar with big data. On the elemental side, yes, we've had some advances in the analytical instruments that we use. We've had some advancements in the way we prepare the specimens before we do the elemental analysis. But by and large, the statistics that we use to interpret the results, they've been rather static. So these are classical statistical methods that have been around a long, long time. And I'm not saying that's bad. That's probably a good thing. We've had a wealth of knowledge, especially in the arena of ceramic sourcing analysis, in terms of the wealth of knowledge that's come out of this. But, kind of going back to what Dr. Lucius said, there's no geographic component. In other words, there's no statistical measure of uncertainty that has a spatial, a geographic component, which is why, as a geologist, I'm starting on the landscape. So, very briefly, some of these analytical methods, you've probably heard of INAA, Instrumental Neutron Activation Analysis, ICP in various forms. I do a lot of ICP work, by the way. Inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. We've got PIXI, particle-induced X-ray emissions. One of the, not up and coming, been around for a little while, but popular is PXRF and XRF, X-ray fluorescence. All of them are methodologies with which we can look at elemental abundances in artifacts. We want to see patterns in the data. We want to see what makes these things unique. Is there a cultural component in the data? I'm not a culture guy, I'll tell you that right now. But for you folks that are into the cultural aspects, the interaction and exchange, you want to hear what we have to say on this. So this algorithm here, nothing to do with the elemental analysis, nothing to do with the statistics, nothing to do with provenience, really, in the sense of, outside of the context of the science behind it. What this is the science that links the prehistoric materials to the landscape. So the second component, this multivariate statistical analyses, you probably heard of some of these, hierarchical cluster analysis, principal components analysis. It's a form of factor analysis. It's been around since hoteling in 1933. Mahalanobis distances as a function of group membership and so on and so forth. Some of you are familiar with these methodologies. Why beat the data set up with statistics? Well, if you analyze 100 sherds and you've got major, minor, trace, ultra trace, rare earth elements, you've got 20, 30, 40, 50 elements, 50 variables. You can't comprehend that. So we need to reduce the dimensionality of the data set. We do that through statistical methods. What we do with the data is we try and make useful interpretations of it, which by and large end up going into what our interpretations of exchange and interaction are. I thought I would go into a short spiel on principal components analysis, but I'll spare you on that. It's because we're going to run out of time. I want to show you by example. So it's largely and this is kind of very generalized. It's a twofold or two-step process. Elemental analysis, statistics. What are we missing? Well, we're missing the we're missing the geostatistical part of it. We're missing the analysis of the landscape, which after all is in the inherent signature of the sherd, or the inherent signature of the Kiva plaster, for example, which is the hypothesis material that we use for testing. So in geostatistics, and geostatistics, they differ from classical statistical methodologies, some of them anyway, in that one, and most importantly, and I can't stress this enough, there's a spatial component. So as a mining geologist, when I'd go out and look for, say, or map the distribution of a particular ore, maybe it's lead, when I do that, I have a limited ability in the field to take samples. I'm not taking, thousands and thousands of samples. Geostatistical methods allow us to have a limited sample, a representative sample of the population, and predict where these elements, we can predict the distribution of an element or elements across the landscape. 250 square kilometers of the Blanding Tract in southeastern Utah. So I can tell you distributions of things like chromium and titanium and vanadium and holmium and all kinds of other elements. How they change as a function of what we call spatial autocorrelation. It's a geological control. And that's missing from a lot of compositional studies. But it's a misnomer that you have to take all these samples to get a signature. You don't. It's very, very common in the mining industry. We've been doing it for decades. So you've got the statistical component, you've got the elemental component, now you've got the geostatistical component. But I'm going to tell you this. If you analyze with any of those methodologies, raw clays and prehistoric plasters or even prehistoric ceramics, you're not going to find the match. And that's what I was hoping to explain this by. It's not going to happen in the limited time that I have. It's not going to happen. In other words, the science behind linking prehistoric materials, the algorithm that is, that took me 15 years and probably a lot of wine to get to this point to match them. So I'm going to introduce Dave Dove here. You heard earlier. We put the model to the test. If this worked, now think about this, because I'm going to leave you with kind of an open-ended question. If this worked, what this algorithm does, it's programmed in the Python programming language. It's heavy in geostatistics. It's heavy in geospatial modeling, i.e. GIS. What this model does is produces a map of provenience, so that someone like Dave could go out onto the landscape and go to an unsampled location and find something that is analytically capable of reproducing the prehistoric artifact. Does that make sense? It could be pottery, it could be kiva plasters. So David will tell you how we started. How much time do we have in here? 4 minutes, I don't know.
Okay.
I better be quick then.
All right, I'll just tie into Steve's talk here by saying we were excavating in the structure that I had talked about earlier today, and there's a kiva in the center of this great house, and we tested this kiva and came across the walls of the north and the south end of it, and there were clearly many layers of plaster. This structure had been plastered over and re-plastered over and over, and it had actually melted off the side and curled around. And so I was looking at these. They were beautiful. There was some white, there was red, there was gray, and I was commenting to Steve. I said, boy, I'd love to have some of that stuff. I got a building I could stucco that with. It's beautiful, you know. And so we got to thinking. He said, well, maybe we could figure that out. So he does what he just told you he does and created this model of where we should sample to get a representative sample of the area around the site. And so I, as the guinea pig, went out there and took many soil samples, and
Not too many.
it felt like too many. But I gave them to Steve. He analyzed them. He also had analyzed the plaster from all of these. There were 35 layers, and he took a high-speed Dremel, peeled them off, analyzed them with all the different methods that you see in there, and primarily what we were trying to use was it X-ray fluorescence on those,
And ICP.
and ICP, MS or OES, I can't recall. So he generated a map, said go sample these places. I fed the samples to him, and I said, you know, where can I get this stuff? And he said, go out to, gave me the GPS coordinates, and I went there. He said, that's where you're going to get your white plaster.
I provided him with a map of provenience that would tell him where to go on the landscape to sample geological materials that should, in theory, reproduce prehistoric plasters.
So when I got out there, I said, this guy's nuts. Yeah, I've known him for 15 years or more, well, 20 or so, and I know that he is. But anyhow, so I got out there, and this is kind of an olive green colored stuff. I said, how could this make white plaster? Sure enough, I feed it to him. He pulverizes it, and when you pulverize it, it doesn't look the same. It's white. And so he analyzed it, and by gosh, it's exactly, it's a match.
Yeah, the test of the hypothesis was that if he could go out based on this model of provenience, this map that we create, and sample that unsampled that location, the geology that is, the soils based on the geostatistical model, that in a rerun of the entire analysis, that should group in a principal components analysis with prehistoric red or white plaster. And where he went to sample white, sure enough, matched with our prehistoric white plasters. Where he went to sample red, matched with the prehistoric red plasters. What's important here is that we've got an algorithm that works. So we're not using, we're pushing the criterion of abundance aside. And what we're literally doing is linking something that's been manufactured, what's the dates on it was a 13th century kiva plaster, I believe. We're linking that today to the geographic landscape through models of spatial autocorrelation, geostatistical methodologies. But it's above and beyond just the analytical, the elemental methods. It's above and beyond the statistics. It still incorporates them, and it's above and beyond the geostatistics. You can have all that, and you can study as many prehistoric materials and as many geological formations as you want. It's not going to happen you need the algorithm that connects the two. And what it is, and it was in a paper back in 1997, and I'm paraphrasing this, but the true, how does this go? I'm trying to get as close as I can. True provenience or true ceramic sourcing will come about when we can transform the analytical coordinates from principal components onto the geographic landscape. In other words, go from PCA component biplots to the landscape, and that's what we've done. So if it works for plasters, we actually started with shirts. I've been working with Dr. Lucius for quite a while, and so we're testing that model as well. So, I don't know. But as a non-cultural person, I mean, that's kind of the end question here is, for those of you who are interested in sourcing analysis, I can't answer the question, only you can, but how might that change your thought processes on exchange and interaction if we could actually put this within some spatial scale and tether prehistoric materials to the geographic landscape? That's pretty big.
I just close on an archaeological note. The gentleman that was playing for us earlier, an entertaining guy, he was talking about a Wadavy. And Watson Smith did some work out there in the 30s, and when he looked at some of these Kiva plasters, there was, and some of them were 80-something layers. He surmised, even though he didn't have the technology available to test his hypothesis, he surmised that they were able to get this materials real close as provided by nature, in his word. So the first thing that we did is we wanted to look close to this structure. We thought, wouldn't it be nice to know where they get this stuff? It'd be fun. So that's what led to being able to source this. And of course, the nexus is, our next project is to try to apply this to ceramics. There's a lot more variables to work with, but we're well underway, and we think we may be on to something. So stay tuned, folks. Thank you.